Unless you've been hiding underneath a rock over the past couple of years, you know that crossovers, they're all the rage these days. But what is lesser known is that these things, especially the small subcompact variety, they don't have names. For example, CX3, QX30, or heaven help us, HRV. There's just no imagination. It's all alphabet soup instead of something that like stands for something. I remember back in the 50s, Eldorado. Granted, that was a cool car. This, arguably not as cool, this segment. But you still need, actually I would argue, you need more imaginative of a name for a vehicle that's meant for utility for prudent and practical people. Well, apparently somebody's been listening, and that somebody is Hyundai, and they decided to give this thing a name. The name is Kona. Now, this gets us to a point. For the first time ever in almost 9 years and 770 episodes, you and I are going to shoot a new vehicle, really not a car, a crossover, in the place that it was named after. Now you look behind me and the sky is very gray. It looks like it's going to open up and just unleash biblical proportions of rain. And I will tell you that in this tech review, in the coming full first drive review, that indeed does happen. But we're still going to shoot this in its namesake. Take a wild guess where. Okay, so back to the studio to discuss engines. There are two on offer, and there's really no nice way to say this. Let's start with the boring one. It's a 2-liter 4-cylinder gasoline engine. It's good for 147 horsepower, comes in at 6,200 RPM and 132 pounds of torque, which comes in at 4,500 RPM. Then there's the engine that you and I are rather excited about, and it's an engine we've driven a lot before, almost more than that 4-liter twin turbo from these guys that ends up in cars like these as well as Aston Martins, and it's that 1.6-liter 4-cylinder direct injected turbocharged engine, also gasoline. In this guys, it puts out 175 horsepower, which comes in at 5,500 RPM and 195 pounds of torque, which comes in at 1,500 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 4,500 RPM. Now we've driven this in what? The Kia Soul Turbo, Hyundai Sonatas, and that Hyundai Elantra GT that we love so much. Now, two interesting fun facts in this specific case. Number one, do you remember the Dave Coleman episode we just did where he went on and on and on about his Sky Active X 2-liter gasoline engine? Now that is a 16-to-1 compression ratio. In the boring engine, it's 12.5-to-1. In the exciting engine, it's 10-to-1 here. Then there's the fuel economy, which I find very interesting. Both engines, with varying differences in horsepower, have the exact same average fuel economy at 30 mpg. So over the past couple of years, you and I have looked at the interiors of a lot of Hyundais, Kias, Genesis, and no matter how fancy they get, they all kind of have the same themes going on. Like, for example, good, clean design or simple UX, which I like a lot because it is simple. It's not trying to get too complicated for its own good. And then the tactile feel in some areas very good, in some areas not so good. Here, those themes are pretty much going on with the exception of the design. It's changed. Instead of like a European-inspired design like in the Elantra, this is more techno. It looks like someone took a very big, thick tablet and stuck it on the top of the dash. But here I would argue it's more effective than in the Elantra GT because the screen, it's on offer in two sizes, and the more basic ones, it's 7 inches. In this one, this is, I think they call it the Ultimate, this is 8 inches. And like all Hyundai Kias, it's got Apple CarPlay, there's Android Auto, all the different connected apps like Alexa, Google, even Sirius apps in there. So, but let's put that aside because to me that's not as exciting as a couple of other things. This one is fitted with a head-up display. And it's like the CX3 in that this screen pops up. And I was asking Mike O'Brien about this. I'm like, why did you do this? Why did you have to go this complicated solution? Why don't you just put the coating on the windscreen and just be done with it? He was telling me that the replacement cost of a windscreen that is in a car it's fitted with head-up display, it's like $1,000 more. I actually didn't know this. So he's telling me this solution is a cheaper solution. Now I kind of turned that around, and if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, it's not so much they're trying to save you the money on the replacement cost, which they probably are, but it's more about a price point for this, because they're trying to get this below 20,000 US, and to have a windscreen that's $1,000 more, let's say it costs them $400 more, you really can't do that. So this was more, I think, a manufacturing decision, but it's still nice to have a head-up display here, and the thing is like, it's really large. That Mike was telling me it's like 8 inches, and it's not just the speed or the turn signal, that kind of stuff. It's also turn-by-turn direction. So let's put that away. Then there's the tactile feel. Generally pretty good in most areas. Yeah, there's some hard plastic down here, but then again, look at the price point of something like this. Now, tactile feel aside, I think this is more about design. Just look at the outside of the thing. I'm one of these people that like the Juke, so I also like the design of this. But they kind of let me down here in that you can see all the lines there. Remember Bob Lutz told us back in like, what, 2013 about hiders? This line here is what's called a hider, and it hides the step between the top of the dash and the airbag here. But if you look at this, it's just a line. My question is, and think of this as more as like an open letter to the folks at Hyundai Kia, why don't you paint this body color? What would that have cost? Like 50 cents, $1, even $2? By doing that, it would have raised the overall perception of quality on the inside, and frankly would have picked up on the cool design on the outside. So that would be my suggestion for a running change here. Other than that, it's a very pleasant place to be, especially considering this is for a prudent person. Okay, so as we move into driving dynamics, we need to sit down because there is a hell of a lot to cover, more than I thought there would be in a small baby crossover. Let's start with the basic building blocks, and that is the suspension. In the front, no real surprise with McPherson struts, but what's changed is it's a different subframe, and the concept is to move the transmission as well as the intercooler farther forward, and thus it's more packaging space for the passengers. Then in the back, they borrowed a page out of that Elantra GT where there's 2 suspensions on offer. In the front-wheel drive car, it's anything you want as long as it's a wretched torsion beam. If it's the car that we're driving, which is the fancy one, that's all-wheel drive, then that changes to a derivation of that independent suspension we drove on the Elantra GT. But here, it's packaged to be smaller, so there's more space for the cargo. Now, a word to the wise here. This is not an Elantra platform or a future Elantra platform. This is a dedicated, small crossover platform. And I was asking Mike O'Brien, does that mean it's dedicated just to this car? Turns out it isn't. Let's just say Hyundai Kia, they're probably going to be building many cars off this platform, really small crossovers. Then there's the dimensions of the thing. So it's very small. I talked about it at the top of the episode, varying degrees of numbers in that this is not a mature segment yet, like a mid-size crossover, kind of like a RAV4. So this is 102.4 with a length of 164. As a basis of comparison, the Subaru, well, that one is over 2 inches longer in wheelbase and over a foot longer in length. You don't get that kind of variation in other more mature segments. Then there's what's hanging off the suspension, and that's the wheels. So the wheels, anything you want, 16, 17, 18. We're driving the 18, but obviously the most basic car is the 16s. Then there's the brakes. Now also the most basic car, it's a much smaller brake package. So in the front, it's 11-inch diameter. In the back, it's 10.3-inch diameter. In the car we're driving, it's 12-inch diameter in the front and 11.13 in the back. Coefficient of drag is interesting at 0.32, so all that stuff, all that noise in the front doesn't make really a big difference on coefficient of drag. I wouldn't be taking this thing off-road too much, at least rock climbing. Ground clearance 6.7 inches. Then something very, very important, and I've told you this before, Hyundai, they are not a car company, they're really a steel company masquerading as a car company. So this, like every other Hyundai Kia that we've driven, is made up of 52% high-strength steel. Now what does that mean? It means that the vehicle is stronger, but simultaneously lighter. Okay, so with all that technobabble, what's the weight? Well, 2 things. Number 1, you know I like to save this kind of information for the end of these tech reviews. And number 2, somewhat pleasantly surprised here in that the basic boring engine front-wheel drive version, that is 2,890 pounds, and then the fancy one you and I are going to drive in the next episode, 3,256 pounds. So as a basis of comparison, that GT3 we had in here, 195 grand and 500 horsepower, that was like 3,100 and change. And as you know, that was made of unicorns and puppy dogs. So hats off to Hyundai for using high-strength steel to make a somewhat basic car competitive in weight. Then there's 2 other interesting pieces of information. Number 1, not a surprise here in that there is no manual transmission on offer. And frankly, I'm not going to complain about it because I don't think they'd sell a 1 in this segment. But in that 1.6 that you and I are going to drive, Well, that one is fitted with that 7-speed dual clutch we've driven in many other Hyundai Kias that we like a lot. And what's interesting to me about that engine is, like the Steel, they design and make it themselves. So it'll be interesting to drive it around the big island of Hawaii. Then there's the currency of what this thing is, and that's storage. Well, this is not best in class. It's kind of like middle of the road, the Goldilocks version. So at the high end, there's the Honda, the HR-V. That's 24.3 cubic feet in storage. Then like at the low end, which is the Mazda, that's 12.4, and this is kind of in the middle of the road at 19.2. And just as an aside, you and I have only driven 2 other cars in this segment, and that's the CHR and the CX-3. So it's going to be interesting to drive this, especially something called a Kona in Kona. And I'm going to tell you, you not only have to come back for the first drive review, but there's not 1 but 2 surprises, one very embarrassing for me. So with that, I want to leave you with a question, and it's not the usual what would you choose in this segment. This is somewhere between $19,500 for the basic car and up to about 30 grand for the one you are going to drive. So for that kind of money, also in your equivalent currency, what would you choose? Would you choose this like basic small baby buggy? It's kind of fancy. Or would you choose a completely different type of car? And let me know, A, why you would make that choice, and B, what are you doing with it? Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I'm going to say you should download our fancy updated app, which is now available not just on Google, not just on Apple, but also on the Amazon App Store. Until I see you in the full first drive review from Kona, Hawaii, and actually kind of all over the island, bis später.